Well, welcome to the White Owl Reports, once again with Michael Edward. And today, part 5 of this series we've been doing 4 times before now. This is part 5 with Harry Hubbard, IllinoisCaves.com. If you don't know how to spell Illinois, go back to school and find out that it's not Illinois, though it kind of spells that way. Okay, yeah, enough humor for today. Anyway, this is just to pick up where we left off on part 4, and we were beginning to talk about deciphering the Etruscan tablets, and Harry was talking about how his partner in all this research, who I consider an absolute linguistic genius, Paul Shafranki, had basically broken the code not only on this. Harry was mentioning 5 or 6 other remote ancient languages and glyphs. So I don't want to waste any more time introducing Harry, other than Harry is the man who put all this together back, especially around 1995, and got into all this, and that's what his site, IllinoisCaves.com, is all about. As always, the shows are on his site. You can get this part in a couple of days. It'll be posted on his site, along with the other 4 parts we've done already, along with a ton of videos going all the way back to 1995. Right, Harry?
Or even before then. It's a good time to make the point that I didn't hear anything about Burroughs Cave till probably about early 1991, mid-91 or so. And this Burroughs in the Cave issue had been a spectacle for about 10 or 11 years at that time. So this was going on long before Paul and I ever knew anything about it.
Before you
the
ever got
artifacts
involved.
were being sold and plundered. We were quite latecomers to the entire issue.
True, but you and Paul are the ones who put things together, and really for Paul's expertise with linguistics and having the solid background of so many different languages, modern languages, as well as archaic Latin and such. He grew up in a family in Europe that was an important part of their lives, obviously. So between your enthusiasm, without a doubt, and Paul doing your framing on some of your ancient maps, and he turns around and says, "Gee, Harry, would you like me to translate that for you?" So talk about a marriage that nobody knew was going to happen. It sure did come out with some amazing results.
How do 2 fellows from different parts of the world end up in Florida at the same time and end up actually meeting each other? It must have been the hand of God.
Yep.
So picking up with the Etruscan Volume 1 video, some of the naysayers or supposed alleged linguistic or historical experts would say, oh, there wouldn't be any Etruscan in Alexander's tomb. Etruscan was already a dead language for 500 years. This is just impossible. Well, what we came to learn is that Etruscan is simply nothing more, nothing less than a provincial form of Latin, Proto-Latin, as well as many other Italic or Central Italy languages from the highlands. There's a mountain range or 2 that goes right down through the center of Italy. And these languages were common among the townspeople, the villagers. So, in a sense, we call it vernacular or colloquial, for lack of a better word. Given this, the language of Latin actually began to become more and more polished, advanced, codified with the works of, say, Varro, Julius Caesar, Vitruvius, many of the Latin writers, and this was still quite common at that time. Latin was a very popular spoken language. So as Paul busted the Latin, we took the characters, which were old at that time, and just pretty much Paul determined, well, we'll just call it Etruscan or Shaff after his grandfather. So that is where the Etruscan element comes in with the lost tomb of Alexander the Great. Not that these people were Etruscans. The Etruscans had died off. Their buildings were at this time mostly in ruins, but the language had drifted south and north and had become more polished into a more modern form of Latin, and that's what we see on these stones.
So this ancient language was fragmented then and like you said, polished. So
yes.
For somebody with a linguistic background, especially in archaic type of languages like Latin, Paul was able to kind of look through the screen and say, oh, well, they're connected.
Correct. And so people would, or the historians would say, well, if it was Alexander's tomb, we would see Greek. And there is a lot of Greek. We see Greek characters. We see Phoenician or Punic characters. We see a lot of Latin characters all mixed in. And you got to remember that this is from the Mediterranean region, and all of these languages and alphabets were commonly used back and forth amongst the different peoples, different tribes. And I would say back then that most people spoke Latin and Greek. There are a lot of carryover root words. And let's say Julius Caesar, for instance. He obviously spoke and wrote in Latin, but I'm sure he knew Greek. I'm sure he knew his share of Syriac. He probably knew, could understand a lot of spoken Egyptian glyph, as well as Syriac and possibly some Germanic. So these, and even in today's Europe, for it being a relatively small continent or area, say possibly the size or a little bit larger than the United States, there are still many, many languages spoken there today from one country to the next, and most people in Europe do speak more than one language.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, it's necessity, and that's a good parallel. I want to, bring that up right now. Just because, archaic Latin might have been the Roman language for the world, so to speak, of the conquered world during times of heyday of the Roman Empire, doesn't mean that was the only language that was ever spoken. Obviously, Greek had to have a part in there, as well as other languages. So it would be no different than a friend of mine who lives in Switzerland right now, who speaks, as she calls it, High German, which is what the Swiss call their German, as well as Italian, because they border with Italy. She speaks Spanish. She speaks, obviously, English. So it's a good parallel, Harry. Thanks for bringing that up, because for people to claim that only a certain language could have been spoken back then, that just has no common sense behind it. Of course there was a mix.
True. And in Alexandria, Egypt, for instance, a lot of your Greek authors were living in Alexandria, speaking and writing in Greek. And same thing across northern Africa. You had a lot of Greek influence, a lot of Latin influence, and then by the time you got over to Carthage, it was Punic, Phoenician. And then right there, just north of Alexandria, along the eastern Mediterranean coast, there you had another big influence of Punic, Phoenician. Persian was heavily influenced in that area. So all of these languages tied in about, and they were all spoken, and we have to recognize that. So the experts, when they're trying to understand how come we're saying Etruscan or Latin, they have to do a little more research to understand why and how we came to those conclusions and what became of them. So after...
So I'm sorry, you're saying that Etruscan ended up being known as what we would now consider an archaic type of Latin. You said it was polished up and such. So
right. And
the two are really intertwined?
A few
so they're
centuries
intertwined.
later, yes.
Okay.
A lot of
I just want to be clear on that because I don't know, and that's why I'm interrupting you, and I'm sorry for that. I want to get clear on it because a lot of people just aren't going to believe anything about the lost tomb of Alexander the Great sitting in Illinois. And I want to show the credibility of the things that you guys have come up with. That's my whole point with this. So I want to be clear with it all, Harry.
Okay, on the Isaac excerpts video, for instance, you'll see the face of a tablet carved in Latin and borrowed Punic characters, and the syntax and grammar, vocabulary, for lack of a better word, will be clearly Latin, and then on the reverse, on this particular stone, the side of the tablet will be entirely Egyptian glyph. We have many stones have two languages on them. They'll have glyph, and then they'll have some Latin, even with some Greek characters. You may have the name of a Greek god written in Latin characters, and then the rest of the stone might be written in Egyptian glyph. You may have a Greek syntax, for instance, written with Numidian characters. So it goes back and forth. These people wrote as they spoke, as Paul maintains, and they used whatever phonetic characters they knew well. So that's how they pretty much inscribed on these stones. So just make it clear that there are stones that have one part of the stone in one language and then the next part of the stone in a completely different language.
Well, who knows? Perhaps they did that so that people who really only knew partial of, let's say, Greek, but were more Phoenician language-oriented, let's say, that different peoples of different areas would see some of their language in there, perhaps.
Well, it kind of indicates to us that after Octavian became ruler of the Roman Empire, that people from different areas and different ethnic backgrounds were all being persecuted and kind of fled together. They had a common enemy at this point, and they wanted to leave. So using that common interest and that common fear, the common enemy, they all kind of became friends, or probably were already friends. And you had many nobles, patricians, etc., that had slaves that would have been from Carthage or slaves that would have been from Lower Egypt. It's hard to put a pin on it. There's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that we do know, but there's more that we don't know. And we're not claiming to have all of the answers. As time goes on, more answers will come to light as we have more information and more accurate data to work with. Mm-hmm. And so I want to continue that after we completed the Etruscan Volume 1 video at the Ranch House in Palm Bay, we were set to go back up to Illinois. And this was because we had recently met Jack Ward's daughter, who had supplied us with all kinds of new information that we just had absolutely no idea existed. She had all these pictures of piles of gold, and the gold had Egyptian glyph, had Latin characters, had Numidian characters. It was just fascinating. The gold medallions, the gold pieces that we saw, it was continued to be a who's who of history and such. So we quickly wrapped up our loose ends in Florida, and I believe Paul took a short vacation to Mississippi or somewhere else in Florida to visit with his folks, and I came up to Illinois, and we met back up here in Illinois and established a residence just a few miles north of the tomb site. We rented a little house not too far away from where we were going to be working. And at that time, our land lease was still current. So we decided to, with the help of our friends in Florida, the next step was to do earth resistivity. So it was, I believe, in October or November of 1996 that we hired a geological company out of Champaign-Urbana, which is all detailed in Book 2, to come down and perform earth resistivity at the site. And earth resistivity, I can tell you a little about it. You stick a stainless steel rod down into the ground, and you attach these probes to it, these electrodes. Mm-hmm. And it has a brain box that sends a high voltage DC current down into the ground. And there's like 28 of these pods that talk to each other and use computer software to give you an analytical data feedback of the subsurface soils and the materials that are contained within. And resistivity comes to the fact that the less resistivity that is in the ground means that more space is there, air space, and caves, for instance, caverns show up really big with earth resistivity, whereas ground penetration radar and magnetometers, things of that nature, don't do as well in the Illinois soil because the clay has such a high iron content in it. And so earth resistivity was the option out, and we learned this from the geologist. He had worked with earth resistivity, and he was quite familiar with the subsoil content in southern Illinois, and he was sharp as a tack. He was very, very good, and it was very advantageous for us to meet up with him and to have him conduct the earth resistivity tests.
So, Harry, this is when, 1997?
No, fall of 1996.
Oh, okay. And you mentioned a lease, and I know about that. Just want to make it clear that you had leased from the landowner the land at that time so you could do your exploration. Okay.
Correct. And we, at the time, we weren't 100% positive of whether or not the tomb was on his property, but with a land lease, we could do all of the testing that we needed to do to confirm whether or not it was there. If we proved that it wasn't there, then we knew we had to be close and it was some of the adjacent property. The area that we did lease was pictured in all of Burroughs' books and the Ancient American magazine from photos that Burroughs had released, as well as the people who Burroughs had actually taken down into the ravine system. And I want to point out that our producer, Lynn, on I believe it was the first show, and as well as show number 4, has put up dozens of pictures of these ravines and the systems in there. All of these pictures that she put of the woods, me standing on a hill, they're all from right there at the target site, and she's done a very good job. Now, some of the photographs Virginia Horrigan took, many of the photographs I took, and they're all intermeshed and intertwined, but people can get an idea of how rough the area is and what these ravines look like from being down in them, on top of them, to the sides of them, which I thought she did an absolutely brilliant job on it. So, picking back up with fall of 1996, we had to wait until the geologist was able to interpolate the data readings and run the raw data through the software that comes with the unit. And so probably about 3 or 4 weeks or so. And during that time, the weather here turned nasty. There was an ice storm where we had a 2-inch accumulation of ice up here.
Oh, fun.
Oh, yes. And we were iced in where it took like half an hour just to walk from the door to a vehicle, which was only like 30, 40 feet away. You had to be very careful. It was even hard to crawl on all fours. When you're walking on ice, it's quite precarious, and which was new to me. I lived in Florida, so.
Yeah, it's not like walking the beach, Harry.
No, or dodging sand spurs. After probably it was February or January, I was getting behind down in Florida with my work and my projects, so I had to leave. And at that time, in January and February in Florida, it's perfect working outdoor weather for working. So I was able to, my services were needed there, so I left and went back down to Florida and left a skeletal crew up at the house in the Romine Township here. And they continued to drill the drilling rig that our friend Ron had put together that was quite efficient. And they were continuing to drill in the areas where the resistivity showed the highest readings. In the midst of this nasty weather is when he and a couple of members of the crew made a discovery while drilling, and then a lot of the interest shifted from R1, which was the first ravine, into R2, the second ravine.
What did they discover?
Up until that time, up until, I guess, March of 1997, we hadn't put that much emphasis into exploring the second ravine. But after that, we started to take a big interest in the second ravine, and it was in early spring of 1997 that I rented the earth resistivity equipment again, had it shipped to Florida. We went through everything, tested the machinery on sand and a couple of different surfaces in Florida, and then we brought the rig with a crew back up from Florida and reshot resistivity in the second ravine and did some more exploration between the ravines and in different places here in the township just to get better readings.
Why on the first one, R1 you call it, okay, you said, discovered your skeleton crew, discovered what? That things just weren't as the machine was telling them would be down there, or what? I want a little bit
more detail,
Harry, because people want to know, gee, how did you figure it out?
Well, I had a scale clay model about 3 feet by 2.5 feet or so that I traveled with. I made it out of white modeling clay, and I had all the topography on it, and it was of what we called Tomb Hill. So down in Florida, I could put little markers or toothpicks, flags on my clay model and know exactly where the drilling rig was. I knew I could keep up with, I had fences outlined on it. And so when we were when the crew was drilling on the north side of the primary target area, they found, Ron discovered what appeared to be a slab of limestone. So the first thing that that I suggested was just start drilling in a big X and see how far across that limestone is, north and south, and maybe that'll tell us something. And so that's what he did. And I didn't hear from the crew for like over a day. I was hoping to hear from them that night, but golly, I was on pins and needles because I didn't hear from them that day. I didn't hear from them the next day. And so here we are down in Florida just on pins and needles. Well, what happened to the crew? Well, come to find out, they had found the limitations of the limestone, and they discovered which direction it was going. And from there, they started their research into the second ravine.
So
and then
how
when
deep
we
were they drilling?
back from them. Pardon me?
How deep were they drilling? They were in this R1 area, which was your first primary target area, according to a lot of the things that Russell Burroughs had written in his maps and pictures and such. So how deep did they drill? Was this just like a fence post auger or what?
No, it was smaller holes than that because we were just trying to drill down and then to see if the bits would drop. See, these drilling units, they'll pound from the top while spinning, and if the auger bit drops and falls down, well, then you've obviously hit some type of cavity or void, open space.
You've hit a hollow or some very, very soft dirt, which would show something like
they
even a natural cave.
Right, they didn't hit a cavity, but they could tell by what the bits were bringing up that was a limestone, and they kind of saw that it went into an angular type of direction. And then they started to probe more in the R2 ravine. They were going down, back to your question, going down probably about 25 feet That's what we were looking for. Had to be close to the surface, so that I didn't feel there was any need to be drilling like 40 or 60 feet because that's way below the water table.
Sure,
we knew the water table at the high points was only about 40, 50 feet underneath the surface at the highest points. So when you came down there, we figured that the water table would be probably 25 to 30 feet, which we were correct.
Right, so you've got a hill, and you have a ravine, which you're calling R1 on the south side, and then I presume R2 is on the north side, on the other side of the hill. Am I getting this right?
The R1 ravine runs in a northwest-southeast direction. It's kind of angular to magnetic north. And the R2 ravine runs in a north-south direction. Mm-hmm. So from there's not really, there are east and west, north and south points really in both ravines.
Hill in between? I mean, basically like a ravine-type hill in between?
There is a hill that separates R1 and R2 that's a little over 700 feet across at the widest point, about 750 feet or so. Mm-hmm. And then it narrows down at the lick branch to where the R1 and R2 ravines come into the lick branch. It's probably 200, 250 feet from each other at the most. So they both run into a branch as the land terrain kind of slopes towards the south. There's a creek there, and which catches the water runoff. R1 ravine drains probably about, I would say maybe 80 to 100 acres, and the R2 ravine drains probably about 40 to 50 acres.
Wow. So somewhere in between is where your target is then.
Right. Yeah, at that point, yes. Yes.
All right, Harry, let's take a quick break here. And
okay.
I know you just had a tooth pulled, so
oh, yeah.
Go ahead and throw some numbs on
there. Whatever.
Yeah, my dad used to insist that Canadian Club whiskey was the best thing for a pulled tooth. Numbs it or Canadian Club, whatever you're going for, Harry, I'm sure it'll work. So let's just give you a break here really quick, and we'll be back in just a few minutes.
Informed, enlightened, alive and amplified. This is the Living Light Network.
Well, we're back. This is White Owl Reports, Michael Edward, and this is part 5 of the series with Harry Hubbard of IllinoisCaves.com, Lost Tomb of Alexander the Great. Yeah, it sounds a little remarkable, but southern Illinois is known as Little Egypt. It's even advertised that way, and you got to have an open mind with things. Just because certain books tell you that things are the way they're supposed to be, believe me, history has been rewritten to suit those who want it a certain way. Doesn't mean it's reality. I got Harry back on here. We were just talking about, or he was talking about, his target sites and describing, at my insistence, the difference between R1, as he calls it, and R2, these two ravines in this area in southern Illinois. We had already spoken about deciphering the Etruscan glyphs and language and other ancient languages of artifacts that have been pulled out from this tomb. So, Harry, where do we go from there?
Well, we can pick up where in spring of 1997, I rented the Earth resistivity machine. We checked out R2 ravine and did find open cavities, and it appeared that there were man-made caverns because caves do not naturally occur in sandstone. Caves naturally occur in limestone because the acids in the water from rain runoff, etc., they will carve holes in this limestone, whereas in sandstone they do not. But the sandstone here is not a super hard sandstone in the ground. It becomes more hard the longer it is exposed to air or the atmosphere. There's like 4 different grades of sandstone here in this part of Illinois. The softest sandstone just barely holds itself together. You can kind of scrape it with your nails or a piece of wood even, and that's underneath the surface. And then as you go up higher, the sandstone, like in the backs of the shelters, it'll hold together, but it will crack and snap and fall off in big chunks. And then you have a harder sandstone, and then you have a real hard type of ringing sandstone. So the sandstone that we're talking about where these caverns were cut or manufactured, carved rather, it was quite soft. It barely holds together, and as time and elements dry it out, it does become more solidified. So from there, after we had the information from that, there were several other things going on, and that's when there was a big auction in Peoria about that time of artifacts from Thelma McLean's collection, and there were more and more artifacts coming on the market that Burroughs had sold to people many years previous. And as the Ancient American magazine that did an expose on us and this project, as it began to circulate more, we attracted a man that was affiliated with Global Science Congress out of Denver. And he called me up one day and spoke. He had read the magazine, and he was quite knowledgeable from the magazine. We tried to make it where if anybody went through any one section of our information, they would have a really good, well-rounded idea of what had happened, be it the web page,
the magazine, back
the
up,
magazine,
Harry.
a book, etc. And so he brought a group from Denver out, and we ended up being on the roster at Global Sciences in Denver, and that was August of 1997. And then is where we cut the workshop video and the lecture video. The lecture video was a few hours before the workshop video. That's how come
magazine. Harry, which magazine? What was the name of the magazine that attracted this gentleman from Denver?
That was Ancient American Volume 16, Issue 16.
Okay.
The one that had Jack Ward rolling in the gold.
Oh, yeah.
On the front cover. And
yeah.
So
good thing I have a copy that you sent me.
Yeah.
That's an amazing picture. Not to interrupt you with that, but that's amazing.
It's the smile on his face that really is the kicker.
Yeah.
That grin on his face, what I'm describing for your listeners who have not seen, maybe you could post a picture of that at some point.
Yeah, we'll get that up on your site.
The front cover is Jack Ward, an older man, probably in his mid-80s, laying down in a pile of gold, holding up a really nice golden breast medallion, probably about 10 or 11 inches wide or long, and 3 or 4 inches in height. And
but it wasn't just
smile
gold,
on his
Harry.
face.
It was ancient history. It wasn't just gold. It was artifacts that came out of the cave. It was not just gold. It was real history that's not in any book.
Yeah. And so given
I have
that
grin too, believe me.
So given that, we ended up doing our speeches in Denver. And the book details how me and Paul do speeches and lectures. We don't prepare anything until after we get wherever it is that we are. We try to feel the crowd, feel the audience, see who knows us there, and kind of feel what it is they would be interested in hearing. We take enough material with us to do several presentations concerning many different topics, and then kind of feel which way we want to take it. And in Denver, it was a blowout. We had a blast. People loved us, and they learned a lot. There was a lot of history thrown back and forth there. And we covered a lot of ground, and that's where we did the video Dead Sea Scrolls Mystery, where I did the Denver lecture, where I showed several of these ancient maps, as you call them, and I highlighted the Atlantis map in that because I thought it was a good forum to do that. There were a lot of people really open to these maps and what they said.
Well, for the listeners, Harry, all these videos are on your site right now. They're on ours as well, but let's get them over to IllinoisCaves.com, and they can click your video section, and they can see this for themselves.
They can see what we came up with. And sticking to the storyline that we've kind of been following concerning the issue of our videos and how we did what it was at the time that we put things together. After the Denver trip, I believe it was about a month or two after that, Paul moved to Biloxi, Mississippi, and I was still in Florida with my obligations, and I got an invite to speak in Chicago, and that was June of 1998. And I had conferred with Paul, and we figured it was time. We'd been holding on to a lot of the decipherments. We'd been holding on to a lot of the information that we had from the tablets that were purchased by different people on the black market through Russell Burroughs. And we determined it was time to come out more with the scripted tablets and the carved tablets that were concerning aliens, or what we would call creatures or people, beings from other worlds, other planets, spaceships, flying saucers, et cetera, which at that time we already had dozens and dozens, and I was going to have to condense it all. The gentleman in charge of the Seven Continent Dowsers Association had told me that's what he wanted to see and hear. He wanted to see a presentation on that, so I said, okay, I'll do it, because it seems that the more controversial it is, our audience, they wanted to see it too, and I guess it never fails. What we think is going to be obscure or too much, too outlandish, that's what people seem to be drawn to the most. The higher intellectual people that are not so institutionalized with the Smithsonian or the draconian media of sorts, because you get a lot of people that do not believe in any kind of flying saucers or alien beings, and like a really a smart fellow told me years ago, he said, there are reporters and people in the media and politicians that you can take and put them on a flying spaceship, put them on a flying saucer, and say, okay, now you're standing in a flying saucer, and they're going to say, no, I don't believe in that.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, which is true. That's how we are. I guess a lot of people are programmed. They don't spend enough time out at night. I had an early jump on that because my father was born in Texas and grew up in Arizona. And between Arizona and Texas is a vast land known as New Mexico. And you cannot be in New Mexico, Arizona, or West Texas for any length of time whatsoever without seeing very strange things moving around in the skies at night. And my father had seen these as a boy. It was common knowledge. You go anywhere in New Mexico, southern New Mexico, middle New Mexico, and that's all people talk about, even today. And in southern Arizona too. Well, Phoenix lights everywhere. It's not something that do you believe in this, do you believe in that? It's just something that the media and I guess our government, particularly the military, try to obscure. So it was time, getting back to the video, it was time to bring this out. And I had so much material to cover with that, I had to pick and choose. I certainly couldn't discuss all of the videos, all of the photographs and the artifacts that had these creatures on them. So I chose a certain few and did some deciphering there for these people and showed them a bunch. And I showed them other things, too, not just artifacts from Alexander's tomb, but different stories from different books, and I related some of my own personal accounts and some of my information and data that I had gleaned from other books. So it kind of breaks into the fact that I had read all these books about UFOs and flying saucers, and we took that and tied it into Aliens from the Lost Tomb, and that's what the video became known as. I believe when we first did it, it was Ancient Astronauts from Alexander's tomb. But Ancient Astronauts was a cliche, so we wanted to stay away from that. And from there, that video was born. And I believe that video went online just last night, which would have been Saturday, October the 23rd or 22nd or so.
Right. It'll be shown on our Living Light Network Vimeo channel. It's there, not privately. It's there, not up on the front yet, because Lynn had to take a break this weekend, and we're doing a Sunday broadcast right now. So we're going to play catch up.
It will be online, and I sent our producer Lynn a bunch of extra, like 30 or 40 extra photographs that are not used in the video, so somebody can just continue and looking at all of these ancient artifacts with creatures in helmets, creatures inside what appear to be spaceships, on and on and on. Obviously, humanoid-type people that are not from here, never lived here that we know of. Visitors. We can call them visitors. And
well, by the time people hear this program in the archives area, we're going to make sure all those links are there. We're kind of a rush because my producer and friend Lynn wanted to make sure she just got this up, and it's not identified as it will be in the next 24 hours. So just wanted to make that point. She also did the pictures you're talking about. She did them where you can see them on our Vimeo channel once we have it identified that way, as well as on Flickr. A lot of people know about Flickr, FLICKR.com. Just look up Illinois Caves there, even right now, and you'll be able to see these photos you're talking about. And they'll be on your site as well within the next 48, 72 hours.
And the basic gist of that video is that these people here in North America, they carved on these stones what they saw. And they saw a lot in the air, and they describe them. And to what extent there was commerce, communication, we don't know, but there sure is a lot of very, very strange creatures introduced in these tablets that I have not seen on. It's really the last word. As far as I can tell, this video cut in 1998 is still the last word on all of the ancient aliens. There's nothing on the History Channel that compares to it. Nope. This is stuff right in your face with no speculation, with no ambiguity at all. And
I agree.
There's nothing else like it. There's nothing else like it, and it's still the last word. There's been nothing new in the alien/UFO flying saucer world that even comes close. I'm not just saying that because it was a video that I did that had me in it. It's just that everything else is pretty much old hat. It's the only thing that's new that I have seen at all. And you can get
Harry,
yes.
You know what really intrigues me, because I did enhancements on some of the artifacts. Not enhance them to change them, to bring out carvings that were in them so people could see them easier. And that's when it really started to hit me. I was very seriously wondering, was this what they had carved at the time when they made the Illinois Caves, or had they brought many of these from even more ancient times? And that's the thing that got me. These, to me, seem, and just my opinion, seem to be even more ancient than the Illinois Caves.
Many of them are. Some of the marble heads of these creatures appear to be much older than some of the black stones, the Lavanya stones. And some of the larger reptilian heads seemed to be much, much older. And in the video, as you can see, I go through many ancient authors that talk about these strange lights in the sky, these strange portents, on and on and on. So many people wrote about them. And what it was amazing to me is the clarity and the expressions carved in the facial features of some of these creatures that are just so amazing and beautiful that if the guy walked into the bar, you would recognize him. Oh, that's the guy that's on the rock. Even though he may be a short little fella with a very round head. You know, it's like, that's him, you know. It just...
Oh, yeah.
Was
they jump out
amazing.
At you. That's what I was trying to say. Probably didn't get into describing as well as I should have, but the details when I enhanced the contrast on some of these photos from these artifacts, these stone carvings, just it started pulling out details. Which,
yes, the
again,
faces.
We've got that in there right now on your Flickr and on the not the video itself, but the pictures that accompany the video on Vimeo on our Living Light Network channel. It's details that are unbelievable when you enhance the contrast, and you can actually see the carvings much easier. Harry, there's one that, if that isn't a freaking spacesuit from Chuck Yeager, I don't know what is.
There's several of them that are. There's helmets from Neil Armstrong. There's and the little diplomat kind of guy, ambassador with the real kind, nice looking face, and his tunic, his clothes are just so detailed and so beautiful. And of course his hands don't look human at all. And then they've got all those what appear to be grays in baby clothes. And then the one that I was describing at the conference of the three aliens singing, well, maybe they were chirping at each other. I don't know, but it appears that with the halos and glowing around their heads that they're communicating something. It's all speculation and of what we think, but boy, there it is. So I found that photograph, said I got to get that to Lynn. And so
it's kind of like you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, even though they don't seem to fit what we want. Nonetheless, they exist, and they did come out of the same cave. they're there with all the other ones that look to be what we want them to be, I guess. So we've got to take the baby and the bathwater as one thing here.
Well, you tip a little bit of the water out, then you look back in the tub, and there's more. Then you put a little bit more out and look back in it. You can't, like you say, you can't just swash it all out. But the evidences are too many, and they are too clearly defined, and you have no ambiguity whatsoever. That is exactly what these people were looking at, and it looks as though some of these creatures were standing there in front of the artist while they were being carved in their portraits, which is amazing. That's and I want to pick up there with the next show and go into more detail concerning the artifacts. I think it's a good time now that the aliens video was probably the last one that I cut for many years, and so we can take that from these obviously wild types of people, creatures, and concerning the artifacts, and take that and move with more artifacts, and then me just describing what so many of these artifacts depict. If that's okay with you, we'll just discuss artifacts for a show or two.
We're going to go wherever you want to go with this, Harry, because I'm listening to get a reality history lesson at the same time. It's kind of my point of, you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There are a lot of things that we don't want to believe. But, when something's carved in stone and it's in detail and it came along with ancient things that are in ancient glyphs, and they're all bunched together, and they come out of the same spot, and it doesn't matter whether it's southern Illinois or anywhere. You got to pay attention to it.
Correct.
You have to pay attention.
And these ancient artisans, they carved what they saw. They could only carve what they were looking at. They could only write about something that they witnessed themselves or someone who was next to them witnessed. It's just amazing that so many of these artisans actually did eyewitness their accounts and were able to carve them. How many of these artisans there were, we do not know. But someday maybe we will.
Well, there were a lot of stone cutters to make those caves, that's no doubt. So perhaps a lot of them were stone artists at the same time. You know, a little common sense here.
Correct.
Well, Harry, we ran out of time. We're close to running out, so can't wait for part 6. This has been fun.
Well, I'm fired up. I'm ready to go.
Well, okay, so what are we doing on part 6? We're heading into the alien issue a little bit more?
Well, no, we'll pick up with that. By then, maybe you and if people have questions for me, they can email me or they can email you. We can answer questions on this show as well as anywhere else, and we'll pick up with the artifacts. We're going to talk about our other artifacts from North America, how all this correlates, and then we're going to concentrate on the artifacts from this tomb here.
Excellent. Well, you know, I get intrigued on every show. You know, even though I've had the chance to read your memoirs and the books you're putting together, I've got a little bit of inside info. But Harry, it's intriguing.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we're gonna go ahead and break it for part 5. And Harry, thank you again for educating us.
It's my pleasure.
All right, we'll catch you next week, Harry. Thanks again. And you're listening to White Owl Report's Michael Edward, and this is part 5, Lost Tomb of Alexander the Great, with Harry Hubbard of IllinoisCaves.com. Just go in there and look at his videos. You can also catch every part of this series that we're doing here on the radio. You can catch it there as well. Each week we'll post each week's new episode. So go in there, look at the pictures, look at the videos, get educated because it exists, it's there, and artifacts don't lie. What's written in stone is written in stone, even those, as Harry mentioned last week, people have come in with fakes trying to make money off of it, but the real stuff is the real stuff. And get ready for next week. It's going to be an exciting show. This is Michael Edward. I appreciate you listening. Catch you next week.
Informed, enlightened, alive and amplified. This is the Living Light Network.
Etruscan or Shaft after his grandfather. So that is where the Etruscan element comes in with the Lost Tomb of Alexander the Great. Not that these people were Etruscans. The Etruscans had died off. Their buildings were, at this time, mostly in ruins. But the language had drifted south and north and had become more polished into a more modern form of Latin, and that's what we see on these stones.
So this ancient language was fragmented then and like you said, polished. So
yes.
For somebody with a linguistic background, especially in archaic type of languages like Latin, Paul was able to kind of look through the screen and say, oh, well, they're connected.
Correct. And so people would, or the historians would say, well, if it was Alexander's tomb, we would see Greek. And there is a lot of Greek. We see Greek characters. We see Phoenician or Punic characters. We see a lot of Latin characters all mixed in, and you got to remember that this is from the Mediterranean region, and all of these languages and alphabets were commonly used back and forth amongst the different peoples, different tribes, and I would say back then that most people spoke Latin and Greek. There are a lot of carryover root words, and let's say
done already, along with a ton of videos going all the way back to 1995, right, Harry?
Or even before then. It's a good time to make the point that I didn't hear anything about Burroughs or Burroughs Cave till probably about early 1991, mid-91 or so. And this Burroughs in the Cave issue had been a spectacle for about 10 or 11 years at that time. So this was going on long before Paul and I ever knew anything about it.
Before you
the
ever got
artifacts were
involved.
being sold and plundered. We were quite latecomers to the entire issue.
True, but you and Paul are the ones who put things together, and really for Paul's expertise with linguistics and having the solid background of so many different languages, modern languages, as well as archaic Latin and such. He grew up in a family in Europe that was an important part of their lives, obviously. So between your enthusiasm, without a doubt, and Paul doing your framing on some of your ancient maps, and he turns around and says, "Gee, Harry, would you like me to translate that for you?" So talk about a marriage that nobody knew was going to happen. It sure did come out with some amazing results.
How do two fellows from different parts of the world end up in Florida at the same time and end up actually meeting each other? It must have been the hand of God.
Yep.
So picking up with the Etruscan Volume 1 video, some of the naysayers or supposed alleged linguistic or historical experts would say, oh, there wouldn't be any Etruscan in Alexander's tomb. Etruscan was already a dead language for 500 years. This is just impossible. Well, what we came to learn is that Etruscan is simply nothing more, nothing less than a provincial form of Latin, Proto-Latin, as well as many other Italic or Central Italy languages from the highlands. There's a mountain range or two that goes right down through the center of Italy. And these languages were common among the townspeople, the villagers. So, in a sense, we call it vernacular or colloquial, for lack of a better word. Given this, the language of Latin actually began to become more and more polished, advanced, codified with the works of, say, Varro, Julius Caesar, Vitruvius, many of the Latin writers, and this was still quite common at that time. Latin was a very popular spoken language. So as Paul busted the Latin, we took the characters, which were old at that time, and just pretty much Paul determined, well, we'll just call it Julius Caesar, for instance. He obviously spoke and wrote in Latin, but I'm sure he knew Greek. I'm sure he knew his share of Syriac. He probably knew, could understand a lot of spoken Egyptian glyph, as well as Syriac and possibly some Germanic. So these, and even in today's Europe, for it being a relatively small continent or area, say possibly the size or a little bit larger than the United States, there are still many, many languages spoken there today from one country to the next, and most people in Europe do speak more than one language.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, it's necessity, and that's a good parallel. I want to, bring that up right now. Just because, archaic Latin might have been the Roman language for the world, so to speak, of the conquered world during times of heyday of the Roman Empire, doesn't mean that was the only language that was ever spoken. Obviously, Greek had to have a part in there, as well as other languages. So it would be no different than a friend of mine who lives in Switzerland right now, who speaks, as she calls it, High German, which is what the Swiss call their German, as well as Italian, because they border with Italy. She speaks Spanish. She speaks well, welcome to the White Owl Reports, once again with Michael Edward. And today, part 5 of this series we've been doing 4 times before now. This is part 5 with Harry Hubbard, IllinoisCaves.com. You don't know how to spell Illinois, go back to school and find out that it's not Illinois, though it kind of spells that way. Okay, yeah, enough humor for today. Anyway, this is just to pick up where we left off on part 4. And we were beginning to talk about deciphering the Etruscan tablets. And Harry was talking about how his partner in all this research, who I consider an absolute linguistic genius, Paul Shafranki, had basically broken the code not only on this. Harry was mentioning 5 or 6 other remote ancient languages and glyphs. So I don't want to waste any more time introducing Harry, other than Harry is the man who put all this together back, especially around 1995, and got into all this, and that's what his site, IllinoisCaves.com, is all about. As always, the shows are on his site. You can get this part in a couple of days. It'll be posted on his site, along with the other 4 parts we've